Okay, what's going on, family? Big welcome to this morning's teach on what we are calling is the new normal. And I'm thrilled that you've decided, as like always, to join us, whether you are now live on Zoom or you're watching back on YouTube. And one thing we do know is that we are living in extraordinary times. Our lives, haven't they changed in ways we've never seen before? So the big question, the question that I'm asking ourselves, the questions that all of us are asking is, how can we healthily embrace the new? And how can we thrive in our new day, in our new normal? As you will know, a few weeks ago, Nina so eloquently opened this series up, and she explained how we had journeyed through a reading plan of Acts called the New Normal just before the global pandemic hit us in March last year. And then suddenly, as she explained, new normal was everywhere, used on social media, by TV presenters, by politicians to describe the new way of living. Now, I didn't fully understand it then, but what I knew is that it was too much of a coincidence, and the Spirit has highlighted something to us, something in these days, and I believe He's inviting us to search this out in Acts, in this series which we are calling the New Normal. So the big question is how can we healthily embrace the new? How can we thrive in our new day? How does that work in our new normal? And this is right where we were at in our passage, you see. Because in Acts 2, verse 1, we find that there was 120 followers of Jesus. If you look at 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul writes in retrospect, he says that Jesus appeared to 500. 500 people Jesus appeared to after the resurrection. But 10 days later, we only find that there is 120 in the upper room. That means there was 380 people that had different plans. Just think about that. 380 people wasn't there that Jesus appeared to after he resurrected from the grave that missed out on the incubation of the new normal. So here's the two verses for you. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 and Acts 1, 15. And so I want to invite us to think, are we part of the 380 that missed it? Or are we with the 120? Because the 380 had been under the ministry of Jesus. The 380 had agreed with his teaching. The 380 had experienced miracles. They'd seen him after the resurrection, and they have heard the call for him to wait. But for some reason, they wasn't there. And that started to get me thinking, well, why wasn't they there? Why wasn't they there at Pentecost? Why wasn't they there with the 120 that were praying? And I think that's a really good question to ask. Perhaps they decided to take a step back and see what kind of happens, right? You know, not put all their eggs in one basket. Or perhaps they were like Nicodemus, believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but wanted to hold on to the old religious system as well. You see, we can all talk about revival, and we can say the right words, and we can flock to meetings and see great ministers. We can even pray for it. But what Acts is showing us is that we won't see it unless we're ready to let go of the old. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we let go of the old? And this is what you see with the 120. They kind of decided to completely throw their lot in. They jumped in with both feet and they found themselves in the upper room. Because revival is when the culture of heaven influences earth. And culture happens when a group of people flow together in one purpose. And so the 120 wasn't just hanging around waiting. They were preparing, they were heating themselves up, they were incubating and laboring over the promises. The promise of the Holy Spirit with one heart and one mind. The 120 wasn't playing it safe. They were the laying it down people, the no plan B people. And so what we find is that the 380 wasn't part of this incubation. And if you are not fully in, you can't create momentum. And if you can't create momentum, you can't create culture. And if you can't create culture, the culture of heaven cannot be manifested here on earth. And so this is where we are right now. The church is in decline. Now, these are the statistics from the last 38 years, especially in the West. We find that the church is declining at an unprecedented rate. So what does that tell us? It tells us that our current model of church isn't sustainable. It's retracting. And the fact is, we all know this deep down in our heart, that something isn't quite working. So listen to this. According to faithsurvey.com, church attendance has retracted by 52.47%. And that's just in 35 years in the UK. Isn't that worrying? And the British Social Attitude Survey indicates that the current rate of decline, that Anglicanism is set to disappear from Britain by 2033. And if that's true, that's only 12 years away. And according to the UK census, between 2001 and 2011, the number of Christians born in the UK fell by 5.3 million. And that's about 10,000 a week. And with the continued rate of decline at this level, the number of UK-born Christians would be reduced to zero. Listen, zero by 2067. Now, I did a bit of math. And Ethan is my oldest son. And so if I calculate this based upon Ethan's age, and if these statistics are correct, by the time Ethan is 60, it will be zero. All of this data is running before the church hit the coronavirus, before all the activities that surrounded the religious church come to a halt, such as youth work, worship, children's work. Where is all of that? I can hear you say, things will open up and things will get better. And people will be back, I'm sure, to religious buildings this year. And I know I won't be popular, but what this does tell us is this, is that if we keep living from yesterday's yesterday's systems, we won't recover. And I really do think that we are close to the end. We are at the last chance saloon. But what should give us great hope this morning is that this is exactly where they were in Acts 2, those 120 just before Pentecost. And so all of this creates the environment where we need God to move. We need revival. We need God to heal our land. And this is what Pentecost was all about. It was about ushering in a new system. It was about ushering in the new normal. But there's a way to do this, because Jesus warns us about mixing the old and the new wine together. And Jesus says that if you mix it together, it will spill. And so we won't get revival if we do this again. We will just end up with another cycle. So how does this happen in our past? How has this happened in the scripture from age-old stories? And so we all know of the story in Numbers 21. And we read that God told Moses to create this bronze serpent, as you can see in the picture here. And it was a symbol of healing for the nations. But in Kings 2:18, later on, God told Hezekiah to destroy it as it had become an object of worship. And so this lets us know that what was right for one generation was right and proper, but it wasn't right for a different time. So the system that once brought nationwide healing was a system of a later generation that was idolatry. I'm sure that if you had spoken to those people, if you had spoken to the Moses generation, they would have praised that system. And to suggest that it would end up being bondage would be absurd to them. But this is what we found here. And so what God did yesterday was good. But what God is doing today is a new thing. And again, we see this in Exodus, where Moses inquires of the Lord in Exodus 1, because the people were thirsty. And the Lord answered Moses and told him to strike the rock. And Moses does what the Lord instructs him. And we have this beautiful picture, as you just see here, of water being brought forth from the rock in the desert place. But as we read on, we find that after 40 years, Moses finds himself back in the same place. And the children of Israel are again without water. But this time, the Lord speaks to Moses and asks him to talk to the rock. You see, heaven has shifted. God is up to something new. But Moses went back to what he knew before. And we read in Numbers 20, he wasn't able to move into the promise because he struck the rock again and missed out on the promise of God. What God did yesterday was good, but God is doing a new thing. And again in Numbers 13, Moses sent out 12 spies, but it was only Joshua and Caleb that come back with the good report. They said, we can possess the land. The other 10 mocked them and laughed at them and said it was ridiculous. And as the nation of Israel crossed over the river Jordan, it was under Joshua's leadership, and Caleb was there, and all of the other Moses generation was gone. They wasn't able to make the transition into the promise. And by now we read that everything from the old wineskin was gone. Moses was gone, and the new had come. And so what God did yesterday was good, but what God is doing today is a new thing. And so this is exactly what Jesus teaches us, and why he describes this relationship between the old wine and the new wine in Mark 2. You see, if it hadn't been for Moses, Joshua would have never stood on the banks of the River Jordan. And if it hadn't been for Joshua, the children of Israel would have never arrived at the promise. Both of these expressions were good in their time, but you can't mix them. New wine comes with fermenting gases and it breaks the skin. And this is why Jesus says you must put new wine into new vessels. If we try to put new wine into the old system, what happens? It breaks the skin. We need a new model for a new time. Just like the 120 were. They were throwing everything in. There was no reserve plan. There was no plan B. This was it. We were going for the new normal. And so the question that you are obviously want to ask me is, but what does the new look like? I mean, how do we embrace this if we don't know what we're heading towards? Well, the good news is, you do. You see, there's this incredible verse within the scriptures, and it's written from the most wisest man that ever lived. And it says, what has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again, and there is nothing new under the sun. What Solomon is saying about God is that everything happens in cycles. Right now, you wouldn't go outside in your shorts, would you? Who would go outside just wearing shorts, it's going to be a bad idea, because we know this cycle is winter. But in the same, if you go outside with jumpers and coats in summertime, it's not going to be a great idea either. You see, we have to understand the times and the season. And that's what the sons of Issachar did when they saw King David. They knew that it was the right time and the right season. And so they called out to David and declared him as king. And it was the same thing that happened with the wise men. They followed the star. The star was a sign of the times and the seasons. And they followed the star and they found the Messiah. They found Jesus. And so we don't have to be smart. The great news is that Acts is our roadmap. And what we are going to do in this series, we're going to demystify the mystical, and we're going to deconstruct the religious, and we're going to explore what's behind the scenes and be brave enough to arrive at our destination. And our destination is Acts 17, verse 6. These men who have turned the world upside down, and there was a group of people that turned the whole world upside down because they followed the pattern, because they understood and embraced the new normal.